Hello guys, and welcome back. You see, there are a lot of chemistry videos on YouTube where people convert some random things into even more random ones. For example, turning paint thinner into cherry soda. And I have always wanted to try something like that myself. There seem to be many videos of people turning eggs into something, so I decided that I will also join this club. I wanted to come up with something that would be really unique and has never been done on YouTube, and after a while of thinking, I had a brilliant idea. Somehow I decided that I want to turn eggs, or more specific, eggshells, into some homemade sunscreen. Actually, I have wanted to do this project for over 2 years now, and I finally got to do it. So let's just jump straight into turning eggs into sunscreen. The first step of this project wasn't in the lab, but rather in the kitchen. For the past week, I have been eating and collecting as many eggs and saving their shells to have as many of them as possible for this video, and maybe I got a little carried away. Anyway, it's better to have too much than not enough, and I can use as much as I like. Now, one thing that I have to point out is that I have already cleaned these shells by boiling them in water to remove as much impurities as possible. Then I thoroughly dried them, and now they are ready for use. Firstly, they need to be broken down to smaller pieces so that they are going to fit into a flask. I did it manually, but if you want to speed up this process or want them to be more pulverized, you can use a blender for this job. Anyway, the shell aren't hard to break by hand, and doing so is also pretty satisfying. After a while of crushing the shells, I was left with a bunch of eggshell pieces. I wanted to know roughly how much eggshells I have, so I got myself a big beaker and loaded it up with eggshells. As you can see, we have about 62 grams of them. But so far, we still only have some regular eggshells, and we haven't really done much to them. So to finally start the transformation, I set up a round bottom flask and I transferred all of the pieces into it. The next thing I'm going to need is some glacial acetic acid. This is nearly 100% acetic acid, and it has a really strong and penetrating vinegar smell. You can think of it as a really concentrated vinegar. Actually, one can substitute the glacial acetic acid for some regular vinegar, and it would dissolve the eggshells just fine, but it would take a lot longer. I also added a bit of water to the mixture to aid with the solubility issues. You can see that almost immediately as the acid is added, that there are a lot of gas bubbles that are being evolved. This is just some carbon dioxide gas, and it is the other product of this reaction. Speaking of it, the acetic acid reacts with eggshells, which are basically made mostly of calcium carbonate, and they form calcium acetate, which is the product we want, and some carbon dioxide gas. This is pretty much it for this simple reaction, and all there is left to do is to wait until all eggshells are dissolved. To speed things up, I also started heating the flask until its contents started boiling, and then held it at mild reflux. I also added a water-cooled condenser to help condense the water vapors that came off. This setup was then left until all of the shells were dissolved. During the reaction, more and more stubborn foam started to form, and I was worried that it could be an issue if too much forms and it starts to overflow from the flask. But in the end, it was fine. Anyway, the reaction was proceeding smoothly, and after a while, I couldn't see any eggshells anymore. So I figured that the reaction must be complete and I stopped the reflux. One thing that stood out to me, though, was the crust that had formed on the surface of the liquid. It looked like it was dry and hard, but in reality, when I poked at it, it was very soft and spongy. So I broke everything up and enabled the stirring again. This time I could see that there was a bunch of off-white powder in the flask and not big pieces of eggshells. And this is all of our product, calcium acetate. There was still a bunch of it dissolved in the liquid that really reminded me of iced coffee, so I had to get it out of there. To do that, the first step was to filter the contents of the flask. I was running out of time, so I just opted for the quickest and easiest approach, and I just used a cloth to filter the solids out of the solution. This filtration is far from optimal, but it wasn't really important to have a crystal clear solution at the end anyway, so it worked just fine. Once the filtration was complete, I was left with a bunch of dirty-looking opaque liquid that still reeked of vinegar, and in the cloth, there were all of the membranes from the eggs. They looked really weird and gross, and I just discarded them. The liquid seemed to be free of those membranes, and I just sealed it in some glass bottles for the time being. Now we have successfully dissolved the eggs into some vinegar, and I named the concoction that I now had in the bottle as egg water. It should primarily contain mostly calcium acetate, and to get it out, I just evaporated all the water off camera on a stove. It took some time, and also the whole time it smelled terrible, but eventually I was left with an off-white lumpy pile of semi-dirty calcium acetate that still had some dark specks of unknown junk in it. It was our product, and purity-wise, it wasn't the best, but that really doesn't matter for the next step. Speaking of it, the next step is pyrolysis of our freshly obtained calcium acetate, and for that I had to become a little creative. You see, the pyrolysis of calcium acetate has been done many times before here on YouTube, and always it seems to be a very dirty and messy process, and it almost certainly destroys the nice and expensive glass flask in which it is usually pyrolyzed. So looking at that tar and pain, I decided to not pyrolyze my calcium acetate in a glass flask, and I had to come up with something different. So after a bit of thinking, I came up with this. As the reaction vessel, I chose a stainless steel water bottle that would not melt or crack under the high heat, and also wouldn't need much care being cleaned after the reaction. I was only pyrolyzing small amounts, so even a smaller one like this would suffice. To condense all of the vapors of the reaction, I just drilled a big hole through the bottle's cap, and I connected the three-way distillation adapter through it with some Teflon tape for help. I was a bit worried that if things became too hot, the Teflon would start decomposing, but the temperature really never went above like 60 degrees Celsius at the bottle's top. So to start the next step, I just had to load the calcium acetate into the But I found the acetate to be a bit chunky for my liking, and I pulverized it using a small handy blender. Once that was done, I transferred now much finer powder into the bottle. Next, I screwed on the cap with the three-way adapter, and I made sure that it was thoroughly sealed. All there is left to do is to assemble the rest of the apparatus. reaction vessel got hotter and hotter, you could observe something starting to condense at the cooler part of the apparatus. This is mostly just water for now, as the calcium acetate isn't fully dry, and before it starts thermally decomposing, excess water will boil off. Now would be the right time to explain what are we even doing with the pyrolysis. You see, when calcium acetate is heated to a high enough temperature, it decomposes, and one of those products is acetone, which is our desired product. And when it forms, it immediately boils, and we can collect it using distillation apparatus. So I basically just had to wait for most of the acetate to finish decomposing. Of course, this wouldn't be a pyrolysis without some side reactions, and you can see that the distillate coming over has a slight yellow color. But what was worse is that during the whole distillation, it smelled really weird, and the acetone had a bit of that smell in it. I noticed that other people that pyrolyzed calcium acetate had this weird smell. So if any of you has an explanation for it, please write it down in the comments. Anyway, I left the pyrolysis run until hardly anything was coming through the apparatus. That left me with quite manageable amount of slightly yellow acetone. It smelled exactly like acetone though, with a slight scent of something smoky. It also burned very well and left behind no residue, so I figured that it is probably okay to just use it in the next final step of the synthesis. Keep in mind that all of this came just from some eggshells and vinegar. No other reagents, just these two, if you can call eggshells a reagent. So, to proceed with the last step of turning eggs into sunscreen, I set up a heating plate and I got a beaker onto it. Then I poured in roughly 100 mils of ethanol. I set this aside, and now I prepare another beaker in which I dissolve 13 grams of sodium hydroxide in 50 mils of water. Then, into the previous beaker, I included 12 milliliters of benzaldehyde as well as 8 milliliters of our eggshell acetone. Then the only step left is to mix the two solutions. This starts the reaction between acetone and benzaldehyde, and it can be immediately seen by the color change. Gradually, the solution takes on more and more color, and eventually it becomes almost red. But then suddenly, a whole lot of white stuff appears, and this all is our final product, dibenzalacetone. As it builds up, the solution once again begins to turn yellow until there is so much product forming that it starts to settle out at the bottom of the beaker. Now, I only need to leave it like this for about half an hour to let it all react. So now let's look at what is happening in the beaker. This reaction is a base-catalyzed crossed aldol condensation in which an aromatic aldehyde reacts with a ketone to form an unsaturated ketone. In this case, acetone reacts with benzaldehyde in the presence of sodium hydroxide to produce dibenzalacetone. This is the active ingredient in our homemade sunscreen. Okay, so the reaction has been going on for quite some time now, and the solution has become red. You can see a lot of precipitated product at the bottom, and that is all our product. One interesting thing that I noticed though is that the solution has a really nice smell to it, and it really is similar to that of ordinary sunscreen, but there is still a lot of product dissolved in the red solution. And to get out most of it, I got myself a big beaker and filled it with a lot of cold water. Then I took the whole reaction beaker and I dumped everything into the water. This step should ensure that pretty much all of the product precipitates out of the solution. But to get the pure product, I need to perform a filtration followed by a recrystallization. So I simply filtered the crude product out, which in fact looked like some grated cheese. And I recrystallized it from minimal amount of boiling ethanol. during which it melted and formed this neat effect. Anyway, the final product didn't look much better, but at least it should be a bit more pure. Now, only thing there is left to do in this video is to accomplish my dreams of turning eggs into sunscreen. And to do that, I just took a random lotion and I put some of it into a beaker. Then I just added in a random amount of my Eggshell Dibenzola product. Then all it needs is some mixing and my Eggshell sunscreen is finished. And then this has to be the most straightforward sunscreen on the planet and also the most inefficient one too. But it is sunscreen after all, and I have to say that I am pretty proud of it. I have fulfilled my dreams of turning some random eggshells into sunscreen, and I can't believe it has turned out so well. Besides, I also have some eggshell acetone left, and if you have any ideas about what should I do with it, write them down in the comments. And with that, I'm wrapping this video up. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, bye!